There's something about government debt that almost everyone assumes is true, and almost no one ever questions. We're told that debt is borrowed money. That borrowed money must eventually be paid back. And that responsible governments, like responsible people, should work toward doing exactly that. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if modern government debt was never designed to be repaid at all? Right now, at this exact moment, governments around the world owe tens of trillions of dollars. Not billions, trillions. Numbers so large they stop feeling real. Numbers that exist more comfortably on spreadsheets than in human imagination. But here's the question no one ever asks. If governments are supposed to pay back their debt, why has global government debt increased every single year for decades? Not decreased, not stabilized, increased every single year. Through economic booms, through recessions, through wars, crises, recoveries, and record-breaking growth. The debt never goes down. And that should bother you. Because if debt were meant to be repaid, at least sometimes, we would see it happen. Even once. Especially during periods of strong economic growth, when governments supposedly have more money, more tax revenue, and more fiscal flexibility. But it doesn't happen. Instead, something very different happens. When old debt comes due, governments don't pay it off. They issue new debt to replace it. They borrow to pay borrowing. They refinance endlessly. They roll the obligation forward, year after year, decade after decade. This isn't a temporary emergency measure. This isn't a response to crisis. This is the system. And once you see that, the entire story we're told about money, debt, and responsibility starts to fall apart. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. If governments actually tried to repay their debt the way households repay mortgages, by cutting spending and raising income, the global economy would collapse. That's not speculation. That's math. Debt at this scale is no longer just a number on a balance sheet. It's the foundation of the entire financial system. Banks depend on it. Pension funds depend on it. Insurance companies depend on it. Financial markets are built on the assumption that government debt will always exist and will always grow. So governments are trapped. They can't pay it back. They can't stop borrowing. And they can't admit either of those things publicly. Instead, they maintain an illusion. An illusion that the debt is temporary. That it will be handled, eventually. That future growth will solve everything. But future growth has been solving it for 40 years, and the debt is larger than it has ever been. This raises a far more unsettling possibility. What if the system only works because the debt is never repaid? What if repayment isn't the goal, but the threat? Because if the debt disappeared, so would the financial structure built on top of it. And once you understand that, a much darker question emerges. The debt can't be repaid, and can't be eliminated, then how does it actually go away? The answer isn't what most people expect. And it doesn't happen loudly. It doesn't happen through defaults or dramatic collapses. It happens quietly, gradually, and almost invisibly. In the next part, we're going to look at the mathematics behind this system, and why, regardless of politics, promises, or good intentions, traditional debt repayment has become mathematically impossible. Because once the numbers cross a certain point, there is no way out. Only different ways of hiding the cost. To understand why government debt can never be repaid, you don't need politics. You don't need ideology. You don't even need economics in the traditional sense. You need math. Cold, indifferent, unavoidable math. Because long before debt becomes a political problem, it becomes a mathematical one. Here's the simple reality most people never see. When a government borrows money, it doesn't just owe the principal. It owes interest. And that interest compounds. Which means the debt is constantly growing, even if the government never borrows another dollar. Now, governments like to reassure the public with a comforting idea. As long as the economy grows, the debt is manageable. That sounds reasonable. But there's a hidden condition buried inside that statement. For debt to remain manageable, the economy must grow faster than the debt plus interest. And that almost never happens for long. If the interest rate on government debt is higher than economic growth, the debt grows faster than the country's ability to pay it. That's what economists call a debt spiral. But here's the part that almost no one talks about. Even when growth does exceed interest, governments still don't pay the debt down. They borrow more. Why? Because growth doesn't create discipline. It creates justification. During good times, politicians don't say, "Great, let's reduce the debt." They say, "The economy is strong. We can afford to spend more." So spending increases. Borrowing increases. And the debt continues to grow. Then recession hits. Tax revenue falls. Spending rises automatically. And governments borrow even more. This time in the name of emergency and stability. The debt grows and booms. The debt grows and busts. There is no phase of the cycle where it shrinks. This is not accidental. It's structural. And the numbers reveal it clearly. Once government debt reaches a certain size relative to the economy, usually around the size of total annual output, traditional repayment becomes impossible. Not difficult. Impossible. Because paying it down would require either massive tax increases that would crush economic activity, or drastic spending cuts that would trigger unemployment, social unrest, and political collapse. So governments don't choose between repayment and irresponsibility. They choose between survival and collapse. And survival always wins. This creates a permanent condition where debt is no longer treated as something to eliminate, only something to manage. Not reduce. Not repay. Just roll forward. Over time, the system quietly changes its rules. Debt stops being something that must be paid back. It becomes something that must be serviced. As long as interest payments can be made, as long as bonds can be rolled over, the system pretends everything is fine. Markets adapt to this reality. Bond investors no longer ask, will this debt ever be repaid? They ask, can it be refinanced? And as long as the answer is yes, the game continues. But this raises an uncomfortable realization. If the system depends on debt never shrinking, if growth only leads to more borrowing, and if repayment would destroy the economy, then the debt is not a temporary burden. It's a permanent feature. Which leads to the most important question of all. If governments can't repay their debt through growth, and can't repay it through taxes, and can't repay it through spending cuts, then how does the debt actually disappear? Because historically it always does. Empires rise and fall. Currencies come and go. Debts vanish. But they don't vanish through responsibility. They vanish through something far quieter. Something far more acceptable politically. Something that doesn't require a vote. In the next part, we're going to look at the real mechanism that makes this entire system work. The one hiding in plain sight. The one that allows governments to repay debt without ever repaying it at all. And once you understand it, you'll start to see it everywhere. Throughout history, governments faced with unpayable debt have always reached the same crossroads. They can default. They can restructure. Or they can devalue. Default is loud. Restructuring is humiliating. But devaluation? Devaluation is quiet. And in the modern world, it has a more respectable name. Inflation. This is the part most people misunderstand, or never learn at all. When governments say they are managing debt, they don't mean paying it back. They mean reducing its real value. If you owe $1 million and each dollar becomes worth half as much, you haven't changed the number on paper, but you've erased half the burden. That is inflation. The debt still exists. The promise is still there. But the purchasing power behind it is gone. And this is not an accident. It is the design. Modern governments almost never eliminate debt through repayment. They eliminate it by changing the value of money itself. And the institution that makes this possible sits at the center of the system. Central banks. Central banks don't raise armies. They don't pass laws. They don't stand for election. They create money. And since the global financial crisis, they've been creating it on a scale that would have been unthinkable just a generation ago. Here's how the mechanism works. When a government issues debt, it sells bonds. Those bonds are supposed to be bought by investors. But when the system becomes overloaded, when the debt grows too large to absorb naturally, central banks step in. They create new money. And they use that money to buy government bonds. Not with savings. Not with tax revenue. With money that did not exist before. On paper, this looks technical, respectable, even boring. In reality, it's revolutionary. Because when a central bank buys government debt with newly created money, it changes the rules entirely. The government still owes the debt. But it now owes it to an institution that can create unlimited currency. And that currency creation slowly reduces the real value of every existing unit of money in the system. Your money, your savings, your salary, your purchasing power. This is why inflation is not a side effect of modern policy. It is the outcome. Inflation is how governments repay what they cannot afford to repay honestly. It allows them to say the debt still exists, while ensuring it never has to be paid back in real terms. And the most effective part? No one has to vote for it. There is no announcement that says, we are transferring wealth from savers to the state. There is no line item on your tax return called currency debasement. Prices just rise. Slowly at first, then persistently, then permanently. And because it happens gradually, it feels natural, inevitable. Like the cost of living simply goes up. But it's not natural. It's policy. Since the last major financial crisis, central banks around the world have expanded their balance sheets by tens of trillions of dollars. Most of that money went directly into purchasing government debt. Debt that would otherwise have required austerity, higher taxes, or default. Instead, it was absorbed and dissolved through inflation. This is why inflation never truly disappears anymore. It may slow. It may pause. But it never reverses. Because reversing it would mean restoring the real value of money. And restoring the real value of money would mean restoring the real value of debt, which the system cannot survive. So inflation becomes permanent. Not high inflation all the time, but constant inflation. A steady erosion. A quiet transfer. And this leads to an uncomfortable realization. If inflation is how debt is repaid, then the people paying it back are not governments. They're everyone who uses the currency. Which raises the next question. If inflation is a hidden tax, who pays it the most? And who benefits from it the most? Because the answer reveals the largest wealth transfer in modern history. And that's what we're going to break down next. Inflation is often described as a general rise in prices. That description is technically correct, and deeply misleading. Because inflation doesn't affect everyone equally. It never has. In reality, inflation is a redistribution mechanism. A transfer of wealth that moves quietly, legally, and continuously from one group of people to another. And once you understand who loses and who wins, the system starts to make sense. Let's start with the losers. If you earn a wage, if you live on a fixed income, if you hold your wealth in cash or savings accounts, inflation works against you. Your salary lags behind rising prices. Your savings lose purchasing power every year. Your money buys less food, less energy, less housing, less security. You are paying the cost of a system you didn't design. Now look at the winners. If you own assets, stocks, real estate, businesses, inflation works for you. As new money enters the system, it doesn't spread evenly. It flows first into financial markets. Asset prices rise faster than wages. Property values inflate. Stock markets climb, often disconnected from real economic productivity. On paper it looks like prosperity. In reality, it's monetary distortion. This is why periods of aggressive money creation are almost always accompanied by asset bubbles. Not because economies suddenly become more productive, but because money becomes less valuable. So prices adjust upward. This creates a system where wealth increasingly concentrates in the hands of those who already own assets, while those who depend on income and savings fall behind. And this is not a coincidence. It is the unavoidable consequence of using inflation as a debt management tool. But the transfer doesn't stop at individuals. It happens between countries as well. And this is where the system becomes truly global. Because one currency sits at the center of it all. The US dollar. Since the end of World War II, the dollar has served as the world's primary reserve currency. Global trade is priced in dollars. International reserves are held in dollars. Government bonds are denominated in dollars. This gives the United States a privilege no other country possesses. It can create money, and the world has to absorb it. When the US expands its money supply to manage its debt, the effects don't stay within its borders. They spill outward. Every country holding dollars sees the value of those reserves decline. Every foreign institution holding US debt absorbs part of the inflation. Every economy using the dollar as a trade medium pays a hidden cost. This is how domestic debt policy becomes a global wealth transfer. It's not enforced through military power. It's not imposed through treaties. It's embedded in the structure of the monetary system itself. And the most remarkable part? Most of the world participates willingly, because opting out is even more dangerous. If countries sell their dollar reserves, they crash their own balance sheets. If they abandon dollar-based trade, they isolate themselves from global markets. So they stay. They absorb the inflation. They hold the debt. They accept the erosion. And the system continues. This is why inflation feels so confusing to most people. They're told it's caused by supply chains, by consumer demand, by external shocks, and sometimes those things matter. But beneath all of it lies a simpler truth. Inflation is the price of maintaining a debt-based system that cannot be allowed to unwind. Which brings us to the most dangerous question of all. What happens if governments actually try to stop? What happens if they attempt to reduce debt instead of inflating it away? Because the answer explains why this system, once created, can never voluntarily end. And that's what we'll look at next. At this point, a reasonable question emerges. If debt is so dangerous, If inflation quietly erodes trust and purchasing power, why don't governments just stop? Why not reduce spending? Why not raise taxes? Why not actually pay the debt down? The answer is simple. Because the moment they try, the system breaks. Government debt is no longer just a liability. It is the foundation of modern finance. Government bonds are treated as risk-free assets. Banks hold them as reserves. Pension funds rely on them for predictable income. Insurance companies use them to match long-term obligations. Entire financial markets are priced around them. Remove government debt, or even significantly reduce its supply, and the structure collapses. There would be no safe assets. No benchmark for interest rates. No stable collateral for trillions of dollars in financial contracts. This is why serious debt reduction triggers panic, not applause. Not because politicians are irresponsible, but because the system has grown dependent on continuous borrowing. Debt has become oxygen. And like oxygen, you don't notice it until it's gone. This is why promises of fiscal discipline always fail. Every election cycle, leaders vow responsibility, balanced budgets, debt reduction. And every time reality intervenes. Cut spending, the economy contracts. Raise taxes, growth stalls and unrest follows. So governments choose the only path that keeps everything standing. They borrow more. They refinance old obligations with new ones. They rely on central banks to stabilize markets. They allow inflation to quietly absorb the cost. This creates a feedback loop. Debt requires inflation. Inflation requires money creation. Money creation inflates asset prices. Asset inflation increases inequality. Inequality fuels political pressure for more spending. And the cycle accelerates. At a certain point, even stopping inflation becomes dangerous. Because higher interest rates increase the cost of servicing debt. Which means governments must either borrow even more, or allow defaults to spread through the system. So inflation becomes the lesser evil. Not good. Just survivable. This is why central banks speak so carefully. Why they promise restraint, while quietly expanding balance sheets. Why they talk about price stability, while tolerating permanent currency erosion. They are not ignorant of the problem. They are managing an impossible situation. A system that cannot go forward honestly, and cannot go backward at all. Which brings us to the final realization. This isn't a temporary phase. This isn't a cycle that will reset. This is the end state of a debt-based monetary system. And the only remaining question is, who understands it, and who doesn't? Because understanding changes how you see money, savings, risk, and the future. And that's where this story ends. By now, one thing should be clear. This system is not broken. It is functioning exactly as designed. A system where debt never disappears, only changes form. Where repayment is replaced by dilution. Where the burden shifts quietly from governments to people who hold the currency. There will be no moment when officials step forward and admit it. No press conference announcing, "We can't pay this back." No vote. No countdown. No dramatic collapse, at least not at first. Instead, the process continues the way it always has. Slowly. Incrementally. Almost invisibly. Prices rise a little faster than wages. Savings lose value year after year. Assets climb out of reach. And each time it happens, the explanation sounds reasonable. Temporary. Necessary. Unexpected. But none of it is temporary. This is the endgame of permanent debt. The debt will not be paid back through growth. It will not be eliminated through discipline. And it will not disappear through reform. It will dissolve. Through inflation. Through currency debasement. Through the gradual erosion of purchasing power. Your money doesn't vanish overnight. It fades. And because it happens quietly, most people never connect the cause to the effect. They feel poorer but don't know why. They work harder, but fall further behind. They blame prices, corporations, politics, anything except the structure itself. But once you see the structure, you can't unsee it. You realize that money is not neutral. That debt is not temporary. And that inflation is not an accident. It is the price of keeping a system alive that can no longer survive on honesty. This isn't about panic. It's about awareness. Because the people who understand the system early don't have to be its victims. They ask different questions. They think in different time frames. They stop taking official narratives at face value. And that's the purpose of this channel. If you're here, it's because you don't just want headlines, you want structure. You don't want noise, you want patterns. You don't want reassurance, you want truth even when it's uncomfortable. If this perspective made you stop and rethink what money really is, what debt really means, and how power actually moves through the financial system, then this is exactly what we do here. This is Finance Archives. Subscribe if you want to understand the forces shaping your wealth long before they show up in your bank account. Because once you understand the game, everything looks different, and the game is already being played.